Hi there, good afternoon. Thank you very much. We are going to have a vote about 4 o'clock, so I will try and rattle through. So I just wanted to dig a bit deeper on some of the points you've already made. So just starting with Dr. Emily, can you talk through where you think the big structural shifts are emerging in the light of the COVID crisis in our economy, and which sectors are likely to be to form the new economy? You've all talked a lot about the areas where COVID has exposed what is coming their way, aviation, other forms of transport, and so on. Could you just run through what you see happening to the economy, and in terms of time frame, what that trajectory might be?
Specifically post-COVID, what's happening?
Yeah.
That might be. I mean, I guess. I mean, I don't have a great professional insight into this, but I mean, it's very clear that there's going to be some sectors of the economy, and we've seen them already, that at least in the short term are going to be under severe pressure, and it may be that there are some elements which through that are just simply going to be very difficult to recover. And I guess one of the things about this about green investment in these areas is that there are equally other areas of the economy where actually investment in those areas could help to substitute for those areas that are currently under severe pressure. And it's almost as though there's a sort of it's almost fortuitous that we've got these two crises that have occurred at the same time, which are usefully different. And so by responding to one and responding to the other at the same time, we might be able to sort of mitigate some of the challenges there. And so clearly there are some communities around the country that are under particular pressure at the moment. And so if investments can be directed towards those, and we've seen that very welcome announcements in terms of jobs targeted at young people in particular, but if those jobs can be combined with the right skills training for the jobs of the future, then I think that would be the most positive way.
Could you just identify which sectors you see as being the major part of the new economy? I mean, we've talked about housing, of course, and other types of physical infrastructure. What other sectors do you see as being part of that new economy?
Well, so I mean, it's all the things that we've listed already in terms of the sort of infrastructure that's required. I'd also point to the digital side of things as well. I mean, that's a sort of transition that we've already talked about being accelerated, and one that can also significantly contribute to a net zero, a new, much more knowledge-based economy. So I would say that it's those elements, that the knowledge economy, some people sometimes call the weightless economy, making sure that is as decarbonised as it can be, and promoting that aspect could be a very positive way forward.
Okay, so if I can turn to other witnesses, in particular, we've talked about transition, but we haven't talked about another area that is going to be of concern, which is around how we ensure that transition is a just transition. So I don't know who would be particularly, who's keen to go on that, but how do we make sure that, obviously the youth focus on young people is helpful, but it's probably not going to be enough to ensure a just transition. What else should the government be doing to make sure that it honours the commitments around net zero, given quite a lot of gains have been made because we've had to shut down? Not the ideal way to do it, but it's one one outcome. And what else should we be doing to ensure that happens, so that we do get public buy-in? Professor Robbins.
Well, thank you. If I may pick this up, I mean, I think one thing that has happened as well as the many other sort of impacts of COVID on this agenda around green finance and decarbonisation. I think it's actually really pushed to the centre the fact that actually, as we made this transition, it needs to be a just transition, one that is fair for all. And I think that chimes with some of the principles from the Committee on Climate Change, that fairness being a key priority of this recovery process. So I think one of the things, in a sense, just transition is already part of the Paris Agreement. I think actually translating it from a policy sense as a commitment, for example, when we come forward with the national infrastructure strategy, when we're thinking about the skills and the retraining that's going to be required. And I think then also the regional dimension. This is the transition is not going to happen equally across the country. The country is very differentiated between rural and post-industrial and urban and so on. So I think that is going to be a really important dimension of this, and enabling people to take part in decisions. We've been working both with investors, but also with banks, and in our latest work, showing what banks can do to support a just transition. We had 8 bank CEOs coming out and showing why this is needed, and I think showing some appetite, including HSBC UK's CEO. So I think there's appetite there from the finance sector, from the institutional investors, from the banking sector, really to connect the E and the S of ESG. That often these three things can sometimes be siloed, but the just transition is essentially connecting the environmental and the social dimensions. So those go together, and I think so. There's appetite from the finance sector, but clear signals that the just transition is part of the government strategy, so the national infrastructure strategy, and then also support. And just to highlight, if I may, on the question of the green gilt or the green sovereign bond, I think it would be very plausible to issue something which could raise money at lower cost for the state, allocate the funds to green sectors, the ones we've all talked about, but also ensure that those also have social impact in terms of jobs, in terms of skills, and also potentially allocating some of those funds to areas of higher deprivation. So I think you could use the green gilt to tackle both the green and the social.
Okay, great, thank you. I noticed, Daniel, did you want to come in? And then
I just had a very quick addition to this. I think the word just transition can often sound very generic, right? And people don't really know what it means. So if you think about what financial institutions are now doing with their lending exposures, we're running scenarios to identify which geographies are most affected, which sectors are most affected. And I think we need to do exactly the same for the UK economy, to identify what do we actually mean, which industries and which parts of the economy are affected, and then almost launch a particular cluster strategy for those. Because I think investors and banks and the wider community here will only be able to act if we finger point a bit more where do we have concerns. I to my knowledge, we haven't done that yet on that basis. Now, for me, that would be the first step to talk about the just transition.
And would you say that is something that from in terms of our own committee, that's something we should be pushing the government to look at? I mean, we've seen the way that coronavirus and the existing inequalities have played out in terms of differential impacts on our constituents and different regions as well, with the economic dimension kicking in. And is that a role for government alongside some others? And who else? Who's doing this kind of work, and who else should be doing this kind?
I think the government will have to face the exact same challenge that every company faces. We used to work in certain pathways, right? Our projections were all linear. The current crisis showed us that we have to plan in scenarios. We are doing this with a number of academic institutions. So we're working with the MIT in this case, but there are many very capable academic institutions in the UK to actually support such a piece of work. But I think it is very unlikely that any future plan can be done on a linear forecast.
Chris, did you want to come in?
I did actually just reflect on the question and the impetus behind it. As I was saying a little earlier, during the course of the crisis, we've seen, and this is from retail investors, ordinary people up and down the country, retail investors investing in the order of £1 billion a month into ESG funds, and some fresh research from Opinion that was showed with us was that 54% of people who are already investors during the crisis have increased the amount they're investing in ESG funds. And so what we see is across the UK population a greater desire to make sure that the money they're investing is put to work in the way that they would want. So greater transparency about what's happening to their investment, and they want to see that local impact in creating jobs and improving the environment. So I think we're seeing that across the country. We're absolutely seeing it from institutional investors, the major pension funds, whose money we're investing as well. And so I think there's a great coming together of what we see in terms of retail investors, voters, and how they want government to be acting, with an opportunity to build that just transition that you were referring to.
Thank you. I'm just going to the bell may ring shortly, but just one for you to think about, and then when I'm back, I'm going to get on to my next section, which is just linking this to the international perspective and Britain's influence, both through the financial markets, which we'll come on to later, but it also in terms of how we enable other countries to commit to honor commitments and agreements during the Paris Agreement, how we make that happen. We made a commitment to put in, I think, something like £100 billion in the previous summits, and only a fraction of that has been provided to emerging economies to make the transition and adaptations, mitigations to reduce their emissions. Given the wealth of expertise in this panel, I just wondered if any of you wanted to speak to that dimension of our influence. And I will have to leave you to think about it while we go and vote.
The earlier session, we did actually have 2 divisions, which is why that we had to suspend for half an hour rather than the originally expected 15 minutes, but welcome back. And Rushanara, can I pass back to you, because I think you were just asking a question at the moment that we had to suspend the committee. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Chair. I wanted to turn the panel's attention onto the international dimension. In previous summits, we agreed as the international community to support developing countries through the Green Climate Fund. I think it was in the order of 100 billion that was committed, but only a fraction of that was actually provided to those countries. And it would be really helpful, given what's happened with coronavirus and the impact on those economies, even more so than our own economies, what should we be doing, both in terms of supporting those countries so that they can meet their commitments, recognizing the challenges that they face if we want to make sure that the global community acts together to reduce emissions and meet the net zero target. Who would like to start? Professor Robbins.
If I may, thank you very, very much for this. So yes, I mean, the global community is committed to mobilizing 100 billion a year in flows to developing countries, led by public sector and then bringing in private capital. We're on a rising track. So we've gone from about 58 billion in 2016 to about 71 billion in 2017. And I think we're probably on course to hit that. But again, we're talking here about billions, and essentially we know that the vast majority of the extra capital that's going to be needed for achieving climate goals, both net zero and resilience, and also the just transition element we're talking about, is going to need to take place in the developing world. So that's a question of trillions. So I think we've got to think about the order of magnitude. So clearly, I think the UK is in a good position, a good track record in terms of public climate finance. Interestingly, the CDC, our development finance institution, has come out with a new climate strategy, which recognizes net zero, resilience, and also the just transition. I think that we also could think about UK export finance and the role it could play in this, and then think obviously about how UK government strategy on sort of mobilizing finance can connect with the pools of capital that are managed in the UK. One thought that certainly I've been discussing with many people is, as you say, in the coronavirus, the country is very hard hit by this, a number of countries are experiencing stress in terms of their sovereign debts. And there are, I think, just interesting discussions underway about how the sort of the green finance and sustainable finance capacity that now exists, which wasn't around in the global financial crisis, how could that be deployed? So, for example, how could countries such as the UK provide sort of first loss mechanisms, guarantee mechanisms for sovereign bond issuance from developing countries, which would then be allocated towards climate and sustainable development goals. So this would be a very cost-efficient use of capital in terms of first loss and guarantees. It's been done on the corporate green bond side through the IFC, but we could similarly think about a application to that's the sovereign side for countries that are able to issue debt. And again, from my discussions, a lot of investors would be very interested in that because it would enable them to come in and back developing countries at this time of crisis.
Would anyone else like to come in on this issue? Daniel.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. And I think, as Nick said, I think we all believe we need to invest about 6 to 7 trillion every year into the energy transition. 2/3 of that is in emerging markets. So I would also caution that we think we can solve that with almost aid money. I think it's important to have that, but it will not solve the problem. So I had 5 quick things on my list, given that you gave us a bit of thinking time over the break of things that we can do that go beyond aid money. The first one is, I think there is a big piece of work to be done to define what is actually sustainable infrastructure and what are the financing mechanisms, and then turn London into the hub for this investment. As we heard before from Chris, investors are hungry for yield, investors are looking for long-dated assets. There may be some need for risk mitigation, but we can have much more impact if we do that risk mitigation here in London and mobilize money. There's a piece of work ongoing that we are leading together with the OECD and the World Bank to actually create that framework of what is sustainable infrastructure and how to mobilize. The second topic for me is, we talked about a lot, how do you make new technologies mature? So Germany was leading on solar, the UK was leading on wind. That is probably a bigger contribution to emerging markets than many other things if we turn new technologies to market readiness and then hand them over to emerging markets. The third topic on my list was actually much more focus on supply chains. While we think we need to invest a lot directly in the countries, we also have an incredible influence. We know that 80% of the carbon footprint sits in our supply chains. Many of these supply chains go into emerging markets, and therefore I think working with companies in the West, how to create incentives in their supply chains to make them greener and make investment in those supply chains, I think is a critical one. The fourth one is, if London could create, or the UK could create, London could create a functioning carbon offset market, we could mobilize a lot of money for nature, for reforestation in emerging markets via the capital markets in London. And then the last point that I have is, if we manage to roll out a functioning regulatory framework between fiscal and monetary and the regulators that can be adopted in other geographies, we would probably do a lot of service, because people look at the UK as a role model to copy, so nobody has to reinvent the wheel. So maybe 5 ideas that go beyond sending money directly, that actually allow us to mobilize trillions, not just billions.
Daniel, just to follow up on that, I mean, I wasn't suggesting it should be direct, but very much along what you are saying. You talked earlier about the Bank of England's 4 tests around this agenda. Do you feel, given what you're saying about UK, the UK and the financial services and what we can do you feel that we could do, that provides the opportunity to do the things, and is it adequate, or do we need to do more? Could we do more?
So I think we've done a great job so far. The UK has done a great job so far to show leadership. Given that COP26 was really positioned as a COP for business and finance, I think that is the moment to take things that at the moment are suggestions and voluntary standards into something that actually can be adopted by many more countries. So I think what the Bank of England, now increasingly the ECB, the Banque de France, the MAS in Singapore are driving, if we could find emerging market geographies to adapt similar standards, we will see a lot of change.
Okay, just quickly to Chris on this. The numbers that that Daniel was talking about, 2/3 for emerging markets of the 6 to 7 trillion a year, is that doable?
Well, I was going to make a couple of comments actually. At the moment, we're managing some 1.7 trillion for international investors through the UK, and deploying that money around the world into those parts of the world. A lot of that is coming through higher growth economies in Asia and so on. Part of the appeal, and this is going back to my comments earlier about making the UK even more attractive and a competitive destination. But part of the reason why the UK is held in such high regard and UK-based investment management firms are sought out by these clients is because of, firstly, the stewardship code. And the UK really carved a swathe when we introduced the stewardship code, and it's been hugely successful in reassuring investors and clarifying to investee companies expectations and how we will deal with them and invest in them, and how we hold them to account. We're currently, and as you will know, the stewardship code has recently been updated, and we're doing a joint project for Treasury at the moment, looking at how we can make the stewardship code even more internationally attractive. And again, that's a great magnet to investment.
Okay.
Could I just also underline the final point that Daniel made about the regulatory environment? I think making sure that actually we have a regulatory environment here in the UK that's conducive to business, which doesn't impose cost after cost and isn't constantly changing, again, would be a boon. But we're all hoping that COP26 provides a great platform opportunity for these ideas next year.
I think
Right. Emily, do I have a minute to bring Dr. Emily in?
Yes. She indicated she wanted to.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, well, actually, really, I just had two very quick points to add to Daniel's list, actually. And the first one was he talked about essentially technology transfer, developing technology, but there's also a role for collaborative R&D development to create locally appropriate solutions. And the second thing that I wanted to add to his list is skills and education. It feels to me as though, actually in this country, but also in particular in many developing countries, there is a large capacity gap in terms of bringing up the skill base that's required for the jobs and the other functions of society going forwards. And so where we can provide that export that skills and education training, then that could be a critical component as well.
Great. Thank you very much.